Now?
Yes.
Can everyone hear me now? No. They still can't hear us.
Try again. They should now. Speak louder.
Okay, they've got us now. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. As you can tell, we've been experiencing some technical difficulties this morning, but it seems like we've got it figured out now. Thank you all for being patient with us. So I'm just going to hop into the introduction real quick, and then we'll get started. Welcome to NCSL's webinar dealing with difficulty converting stakeholders and colleagues into allies and partners. My name is Megan McClure, and I'll be moderating the webinar today, and I'm the NCSL liaison to the Leadership Staff Professional Association. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through our chat box, so feel free to type your questions and to answer any other questions in the box, which is in the lower left hand of your screen. Interaction at all times throughout the presentation is encouraged. And we have already started to talk in the chat, so just feel free if you have ideas, questions, if someone else has a question that you want to answer, go for it. I just want to briefly mention the resources. Above the presentation, you will see a couple tabs with one of them labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint slides. Another tab is labeled Speaker, where you can read the bio for today's speaker. And you can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the week. With that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Larry Schooler. You may remember Larry from previous NCSL webinars, such as From Chaos to Collaboration and Beyond the Hashtag. Larry is a mediator, facilitator, and public engagement consultant, and the author of a manual entitled The Public and Public Policy, Keys to a Successful Community Meeting. Larry, the floor is all yours. So it looks like we're having additional technical difficulties. We can't hear Larry. So let us take a second here to try and get Larry back on the chat.
Hello, can anybody hear me? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Good afternoon or good morning, everybody. If you can hear me, please let me know that in the chat box. I'm speaking to you on the presenter bridge, and this is Larry Schooler. If you can hear me at all, please let me know. And if not, well, that's a sort of foregone conclusion. Okay. This is very interesting. You all can hear me on the conference, on the presenter bridge. I'm just going to let my colleagues know that you all can hear me. So I'm going to go ahead and press forward, guys, and hang in there. I feel a little bit like I'm flying a plane with only part of the controls, but we'll do what we can. Please rest assured that I will make myself available to you all one way or the other if we can't get everything covered on this presentation. I'm going to move to what is my slide 4, which is a definition of conflict. If you all wouldn't mind letting me know that you're seeing what is conflict as a slide on the screen, I would really appreciate that, just so that I know that that piece of this is working and that my slides are lining up with my presentation. So you should see a slide that says, what is conflict, and a definition. If you can see that, just let me know that in the chat window. Great. Okay. Well, here we go, folks. We are here today to talk about my favorite topic, which is conflict and its resolution. And I want to start with kind of what I use as a basic definition of what conflict is. And it comes from a lot of the literature in this field. Conflict occurs when people interact and perceive some sort of incompatibility. Now, what's interesting is that as I look through a lot of your survey responses, and I really appreciate those who got back to us with short notice on the survey, a lot of you talked about interactions you have both with internal colleagues and legislators as well as with the public. And a lot of times the conflict emerges out of that interaction, even if there's not as much of a conflict as the person involved in the conflict may think there is, but the conflict really gets reared up in the interaction. And there's also a lot of perception in play, which is to say that there may be much less incompatibility than the parties involved think there is, but they perceive there to be some issues. So for example, you're trying to hide something from me, or you're trying to take my money, or you're trying to mislead me, or you're trying to do the bidding of one political party or the other. So I want to emphasize that a lot of conflict emerges out of those perceptions, and that it's really important as we think through how to manage some of this conflict, whether it be public or internal. How we do that, I think, is really impacted by unpacking what the perceptions are from the parties inside. And so as I'm going with this, I really want to encourage you to give me your perspective in the chat window. Can you think of instances where the conflict turned out to be based on misperception on the part of the folks you were interacting with rather than some real incompatibility? Not to say that we don't have real incompatibilities, but I think a lot of times it's really rooted in perception. The other thing I want to say as I'm getting through this slide is that conflicts often last longer or shorter based on the way the parties behave and how they react to one another verbally and non-verbally. And the reason I bring that up is that a lot of you talked about the various tactics that you try to deploy, whether it's internal or external conflict. And I think it's really important for you to know that the research into conflict resolution supports the idea that we have the power to get conflicts resolved much more expeditiously, depending on how we manage our behavior. And when I say verbally and non-verbally, I think that is probably pretty intuitive, but we communicate a lot to the public or to whoever we're talking with based on facial expression, based on hand gestures, based on whether we're focused on them with eye contact and not looking at something else or looking away. And so the resolution of conflict is something that is within all of our power, and it is something that we can really impact through both the words we use and also the physicality of how we're communicating. I'm going to move to the next slide, which says State of Affairs. And this is a reflection of a lot of what I heard from you all in your survey responses in terms of the kinds of conflicts that you are dealing with. I want to read to you some of the things that folks shared with me when they talked about the kinds of conflicts they experienced. A lot of folks talked about rudeness, condescension, some even referenced bigotry, ethnic and religious and racial bigotry. People who have a chip on their shoulder about state government and verbally abuse people who have not harmed them personally and are just trying to do their job. People who contact us simply to be heard and not to listen or learn. They call upset but have no interest in hearing our perspective or opinion. They only care to rant. One person just wrote, crazy people. Again, please use the chat window to chime in with the kinds of conflicts that you experience in your day-to-day work inside legislatures. Other folks said unrealistic expectations or incorrect information provided by others, lack of understanding of basic democratic processes, people talking down to me. People have such a poor opinion of state employees in general. They think their point of view is the right one and everyone else is wrong. Everyone else gets turned into everything gets turned into a partisan issue, and people don't consider facts and science. The most frustrating interactions are with those who are so entrenched in their beliefs they're practically incapable of hearing others' opinions, people who are afraid to admit they don't know something. So what I hear in that is displaced anger onto those of us who work inside legislative offices where they are expressing to you an emotion that may have nothing to do with any action on your part, but you are you're the front line in a lot of cases. They also sometimes are so wrapped up in sort of their script that they have a hard time getting off of that script. And when I reference tough clients, what I'm really talking about there is we, of course, all serve the public, the constituents that our legislators represent, but we also serve our bosses. We serve whether it's our legislators or agency directors or what have you, and they can be just as tough, some of you said, as anyone else. Susan writes, conflicts with colleagues as well as superiors, and how you have to deal with each in a different way. People not accepting, Holly says, people not accepting that sometimes you just don't get your way. I think that's really valid. And especially at the state level, we're dealing with such a diverse array of interests, such a diverse array of opinions, that I think it can be very difficult to leave everyone feeling like they've gotten their way or gotten what they want. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. I don't know whether we have the technology going today to do a poll question or not, so I'm going to check in with Shannon and Megan, our team, and Megan says we do. So I think we're going to try to jump into a survey question here. The question is, which of these themes that I just referenced resonates most strongly with your experience working in state legislatures? Virginia also writes, cynicism. They think it's all fixed, and whatever they say, they won't believe you. That's often very frustrating, Virginia. Thanks for sharing that. So the question is, which of the themes that I mentioned, the anger and abuse, the poor communication, and the tough clients resonates most strongly with you? And I'm seeing here in the survey responses, a number of you are saying poor communication. Others are talking about the tough clients. And poor communication is far and away seeming to be the most significant of the themes that we encounter inside our legislatures. We'll give it just a few more seconds for folks to respond. I appreciate your response to the survey, just to get everybody's take. And I think we will go ahead and end the survey here, Megan and Shannon, if that's okay. So about 75% or so said the poor communication theme really resonated with them. 20% said tough clients, and one person said anger and abuse. So thank you all very much for those responses. One of the other things that I think is tricky is figuring out what makes conflict difficult. And I'm actually noticing that I've got a poll question slide ahead of the slide that I wanted to present on. So let me jump ahead a slide to talk a little bit about conflict styles. So one of the things that I think makes conflict difficult to resolve is the notion that we all kind of take different approaches to the resolution of conflict. And so if you look at this diagram, which comes from a long line of researchers into conflict and its resolution, you'll notice that some people really are concerned with sort of winning the argument. You may have family members that fall into that category, or our colleagues. They're very assertive if you look at the left-hand axis, and they're not as interested in being cooperative, and so they fall into that competing category. You could be avoidant, where you are just mainly concerned with having the conflict go away. You're not as concerned about asserting your own needs or interests, or even working with the other side on a resolution. You just kind of want to run from that conflict, so you might be avoidant. Accommodating involves a lot of concessions to the other side, but very little assertion of your own needs. Compromising, which I think a lot of times gets confused with consensus or commingled with consensus, but compromising kind of fits in the middle, where you're asserting some of what's important to you and also trying to cooperate a little bit with the other side, but generally speaking, you're not getting a solution that's ideal for whatever it is you're trying to resolve. Where we're trying to aim is collaborative, where we feel like we, and that could mean our legislator, our legislature, our state, but we, whoever that is asserting what's important to us, what the interests of the state are or what our own interests are, but we're also looking for ways to help meet the other side's needs, not just kind of defeat the other side, so to speak. And so I'm going to go back to my poll question here and see if Megan and Shannon can cue this poll question up. I'm curious which of these conflict styles fits you the best, and I'm also happy to hear some comments from you in the chat window as well about whether you tend to see any of these styles either in your offices or kind of what your experience might be in terms of dealing with the way people approach conflict. My sense from some of the surveys is that a lot of you deal with the very competitive among us, which is to say people who call you that are just sort of determined to prove you wrong and not as concerned with cooperating with you or figuring you out. What's interesting is that quite a number of you are identifying collaborative as the conflict style that fits you the best, which is really interesting to see. About an even split amongst the other styles so far. Again, we've got a survey live on the screen about which of the conflict styles fits you the best, and this relates back to the slide I was just talking about there with different ways of approaching conflict. So it looks as if, generally speaking, a lot of us are categorizing ourselves as in the collaborative space with an even split among the other 4 categories. And I think that's encouraging in the sense that oftentimes the only way that we're really going to get a lasting solution to a conflict we may be having either with a colleague, a superior, or a member of the public is both identifying what's important to us and what's important to them and taking the time to come up with a solution that meets all of our and their key interests. I'm also using a phrase interest a lot, and I just want to clarify what I mean by that. A lot of times in conflict we talk about a distinction between positions and interests. So for example, when you think about something contentious like abortion, people may call themselves, take the position that they are pro-choice or pro-life. The interest, though, may be in protecting the rights of the unborn, or it may be in protecting a woman's right to make decisions about her own well-being. An interest is basically that underlying motivation for someone taking a particular position in a specific context. And the reason that's important is that as we're trying to resolve conflict, whether internally or externally, it's really important to understand where that other person is coming from. So it's not just I'm for or against the bill before the legislature, or I'm for or against immigration or climate change or what have you, but what it is that might be underneath that position that you're taking so that we can look for some common ground, because chances are there's actually more common ground in the interest than there might be in the position, at least in terms of what's readily apparent. So I'm going to go back to the slides now and talk a little bit about another dynamic in play known as the conflict spiral. And the conflict spiral is one of these vicious cycles where you kind of get people into a situation and it sort of just spins out of control without us even realizing what's happening. People who, this is some of what you all said, people who don't listen or who are rude or verbally abusive to government workers, their disregard for the legislators or the legislative process, folks who assume I exist to do their bidding, I'm a public servant or not a slave, which is certainly a powerful statement from one of you in the survey. What I think is important to understand about this spiral is to try to know it when you see it. In other words, when you can tell that you're no longer having that rational conversation, but instead it just kind of keeps going in this vicious cycle where it feels like the other side is really trying to punish or retaliate against you, or that there's low trust. It's not that you're going to say, excuse me, ma'am or sir, you're dragging me into your conflict spiral, but it may be time to say, could I take your name and number and call you back? Could we stop for a second? I just want to kind of share with you some observations about this conversation. I want to make sure I separate kind of your frustration from your concerns about policy so that we can try to get some of those concerns addressed. But when you can tell that it's become less about the substance and more about kind of the people, you're probably going to get stuck in one of these spirals and find it very hard to get out of it. And so the key is to be attentive to these kinds of dynamics and to use language that lets folks know you are here, you're present, you're trying to be responsive to what it is they're concerned about, but at the same time, you want to have the focus be on something that you may have some control over, i.e. a policy matter or something before the legislature rather than sort of a personal grievance. The other slide that I have in this vein talks about some of the tactics, the toxic tactics that people may deploy, and I'd love to know, I'm going to put a poll up here in just a second to ask which of these kind of really resonate. folks who make it about, make one situation the norm. All you public employees are just blank, or, the state is never worried about the common person. Folks who call you names just to kind of feel like they're getting an upper hand, folks who don't let you finish, folks who state their opinion as if it were fact. And so I know that probably what's coming to mind right now is that's great, Dr. Schooler. That's nice that you're telling us all the things we're facing. What do we do about it? Please know that I'm getting there. I'll be there in just a slide or two. But I think what's important to understand is it's helpful for you to develop an awareness of these tactics so that you then can formulate responses. So, for example, the opinion is facts can be responded to with, that's interesting that you're saying that because I hadn't heard that before. I'd actually heard something very different. Where did you hear that piece of information? Or the threatening tactic. I have to say I'm feeling pretty uncomfortable right now in this conversation. Is there a way we could, kind of slow down a minute? Could we take a break? Could I call you back? Could we visit offline? Could I visit with you outside this public meeting? Folks have been asking me about colleagues and superiors, and I think this all applies in those contexts as well. You could be facing these toxic tactics from superiors or from your legislative bosses or from colleagues, and I think it's just important to identify what that's making you feel. So it's not so much stop threatening me or stop ignoring me or stop interrupting me. It's more I'm feeling unsafe. I'm feeling threatened. I'm feeling as if you're sort of judging what I'm saying before I've gotten a chance to really, explain it to you. Or I'm wondering if we can kind of put all the ideas on the table before we judge which ones are the best and which ones aren't. So I'll get into more of the ways we combat this in a second, but I want to just emphasize to you that I'm not trying to just name all the things that you face on a daily basis, but also try to help you orient your responses around an awareness of what these tactics are and a kind of personalized response to them that hopefully will change the tenor of the conversation that you're in. So I'll do one more survey here. It's a poll question, and I think on this one you can choose more than one, but I'm curious which of these have you experienced, and you can, like I said, pick as many as you think apply to you, whether it be blaming, globalizing, making it more than sort of stereotyping a situation rather than it just being the one situation they're in, ignoring what it is that you're saying, calling you names or insulting you, interrupting, judging you, using sarcasm, stating opinion as fact, or actually being threatening verbally or otherwise. So I think you're able to choose more than one answer on this one by pressing Alt-Control for multiple answers. So if you can do that, that's great. If not, maybe just pick the one that first comes to mind. And again, as we're going, unfortunately I can't call upon people to speak on this webinar, so I would like you to feel free to use the chat to either ask specific questions as we're going through or to share some other experiences that you want us to try to tackle over the course of the rest of the time that we're together. Right now it looks like a lot of people encounter stating opinion as fact, which I think is becoming very prevalent in this age that we're in. Certainly the national level politics that we're all witnessing have involved a lot of competition over who thinks they have the facts, who thinks they're speaking the truth. And so I can imagine that that's affecting you all at the state level. A lot of folks talking about interrupting. And I think that one of the things that I've always tried to use in that case, especially if I'm facilitating a meeting internally or externally, is to just make sure that at the very beginning I lay out a discussion agreement that involves us all agreeing to let everybody finish, to make sure that we have an opportunity to hear the end of everybody's sentence rather than jumping in. So I know that sounds extremely elementary, but one of the things that I think we have to do in this country these days is reset our shared commitments to a safe space for dialogue. I think we've migrated away from that in a lot of our conversations, and I think a lot of folks are really wanting to feel safe and to be able to speak their truth. And if they're interrupted or cut off in some other way, then they're not going to do that. So we, in a convening role, need to do our part to say it's important for us all to agree to let each other finish rather than cutting each other off. So I think you can see these results, as can I, but stating opinion is fact, interrupting, ignoring all of some of the top answers that you all shared. So fear not, we are about to get to some actual solutions. I do want to mention one other dynamic that I think came up in several of the surveys, and I think it's relevant here. It's what's known as cognitive dissonance, and this is an idea that people refuse to abandon a preconceived notion or expectation even when something challenges the legitimacy of those perceptions or expectations. They only remember or process what fits into the person's existing understanding. And so this came up a lot. In fact, Judy even mentions it here in the chat window, a preconceived idea of what an agency audit entails. But I think in general what we find is that people decide something whether you're a Democrat or Republican, or they decide something because you're a public servant, or they decide something because you work for a particular legislator, or they decide how you're going to react based on how old or young you are. Someone mentioned generational gaps. And like I said, I mean, this is something that is hard to combat, but I think it's helpful when we are encountering some of these dynamics to just be able to kind of name it and say, I'm sensing that you have had an experience in the past, and so now you're sensing that I'm not going to be as helpful to you as you would like me to be, or it seems like you may have had an experience with one of my colleagues or with another agency or another legislative office, and so that's impacting the way that you're expecting this conversation to go. I know it may seem a little clunky to talk like that, but I think it's really important because a couple of you talked about how sometimes people seemed all sort of jazzed up or revved up about something that once they realized was not true or not accurate was really helpful to diffusing the situation. And so that's something I want to encourage you to work on, whether it's internally or externally, is identifying, where those preconceived notions might be. Are people passing judgment on you based on some sort of group identification and that sort of thing. The other thing that I think is really critical is, going back to what I said earlier, the impacts of both verbal and nonverbal behaviors on the way that a conflict gets resolved. And as you can see, all of these affect one another. So in other words, when it comes to an attitude, it is very reasonable for us in our roles, especially if we've felt beaten up, to get to a place of thinking, I don't like this person that I'm dealing with. I don't want them to get what they want. I am sick of this person. I totally disagree with this person. This person is off their rocker. And I'm not trying to discount someone that may actually be mentally ill, but I'm talking about someone where it's less about mental illness and more about a perception we have that they are, crazy. That's going to impact the way we behave towards that person and the situation that we're in, meaning are we having a calm, seated, one-on-one conversation or a reasonable conversation on the phone, or are we being called out in front of a large room of people where everyone there is kind of aiming their collective energy at the poor sap in front of the room. So the way we structure the conversation, meaning are we able to sit down and look at each other face to face, or are we able to have a calm, unrushed, unhurried conversation on the phone or in some other way? That's going to influence how we conduct ourselves, but we're also going to be influenced in how we conduct ourselves based on the attitude we're bringing to it. And so what I'm going to challenge you to do as part of the resolution of some of your conflicts is to enter it with the idea that I am here to help this person address their concerns. That doesn't mean you have to go out to dinner with the person, put them on your holiday card list, invite them to your wedding, any of that sort of stuff. But it does mean that at least in the time that you're interacting with the person, your attitude could be one of looking for a way to help them. And if you try to imagine someone in your life, whether it be a significant other or a child or a parent, who you naturally want to help, maybe you can imagine the person you're dealing with as being that special person in your life as a way to kind of help your attitude shift in their direction. So it's about orienting our energy in a way that focuses on looking for a way for this person to get their needs met, which will then color the way we communicate with them. And it all starts, I think, with structuring, putting ourselves in situations in which we can have a reasonable conversation. And a lot of times we're put in situations at public hearings or public meetings where that's not always possible. And so the more we can have these interactions in smaller settings, in one-on-one settings, in face-to-face settings, I think the better off we're going to be. A lot of times people draw conclusions based on misperceptions of what someone means in an email or in written communication, and I understand some of our communication has to be in writing, but I think wherever possible we want to try for our communication here to be direct, face-to-face if possible, and born out of an attitude of looking for a way to help the person that's come forward. So again, this is about seeing others differently. You know, you may perceive someone to be bigoted. You may perceive someone to be abusive. You may perceive someone to be disrespectful and rude, and they may be all of those things. And I guess what I'm trying to get across is if your interest is in really resolving the conflict in a conclusive way, in a way that doesn't rear its ugly head over and over again, I think it's incumbent upon you to try to see others in a different way than just rude, disrespectful, abusive, ignorant, or the like, but rather troubled, misinformed, unaware of some of what might be happening that could help address their situation, those kinds of things. That slight shift, I think, is really important. And then a focus, as I mentioned, on collaboration and respect. We're trying to control what we can control. We can't make someone else be collaborative or respectful necessarily, but we can focus on collaboration and respect. And when I say a new conflict, we want to understand, again, not just you're for or against the piece of legislation or a policy, but what is it that you're really, concerned about ultimately? What's at the heart of why you're concerned about this issue? Why is this of concern to you? Why are you so angry about this particular piece of legislation or what have you? And let's brainstorm, you and I, ways that we can resolve this that would meet your interests, but also make sure that we do our jobs as state officials to serve the needs, the best interests of the entire state. So in that vein, I'm going to talk to you about some tactics and some frameworks that I have found successful for myself in the work that I do, trying to forge consensus among a group of people with disparate interests, whether at the local, state, or national level, and I hope that these will be helpful to you. They really fall into a few different categories. One is essentials for communication, one is reflective listening, and one is integrative solutions. And a number of you talked about some things in the survey, and I'd love to hear in the chat as well, that I think are relevant. One person said, by being a good listener and empathetic, sometimes I can actually help someone or provide the assistance they are seeking. My approach is to state my position, stand back, and allow an awkward silence to happen. I think the less I, quote, fight for my position, the more authoritative I can be. I've said what I've said. You either agree with me or you don't. Often, by not continuing the circle of repeating our opposing positions, a compromise can be reached. Someone was verbally attacking us in a meeting. I took him aside and found out why he was lashing out. So that really gets to this notion of understanding a person's interests. You eventually reach a point where you realize that you aren't going to be able to give them an honest informational answer that will satisfy them, so I typically switch to a strictly listening approach in those instances. I won't agree with what they're saying, but I'll sympathize and say that I understand, and then pledge to pass along their comments to the senator. Usually my willingness to listen and relay their comments to my boss is enough to at least satisfy them, even though I didn't necessarily give them any valuable information. There is one thing above all else that I think people want when they're in a conflictual situation, and that is they want to feel heard. Now, of course, they may also want you to take some sort of action that will, address their exact situation. But if we start with making them feel heard, we're going a long way. So I'll get to reflective listening here in just a second. But I want to talk about these three components of good communication. And I know that this is going to seem a little bit odd when I write the word love, because I know some of us may associate love with our significant others, our children, our parents, maybe good friends. But I think ultimately what the author Robert Bolton was talking about here is a concern for the other person's well-being. In other words, you're not trying to love them as your own spouse or partner or child or parent, but you are trying to show that you care about whatever they are caring about. And when it comes to empathy, I think there is a difference between sympathy and empathy, but more importantly, I think people want to understand, people want to see that you understand their feelings, that you're not necessarily feeling exactly what they're feeling or have the same position that they're taking, but that you can empathize, that you can connect to what they're feeling. For example, gosh, that must have really upset you, or I can sense how angry this has made you feel, or you feel really let down by what's happened, or it sounds like another person may have made you feel misled or misinformed, or you felt you were deceived in some way. So again, it's not that we have to suddenly get angry or we have to suddenly get outraged alongside them, but that we feel with whatever it is that they're bringing to the table. And I think when it comes to genuineness, none of this is going to work if we're not able to project that this is truly what we feel. And this gets back to the triangle that I talked about earlier. It's really going to be impacted by the attitude that we're bringing to the conversation. And so if the attitude is, I've got to get this person off my back as quickly as possible, then any of the things that I was just talking about in the way of tactics may come off as being insincere, and that may impact your ability to get past the conflict. So the words that you use have to come from a place of genuineness. And if you're genuinely not in a good place to show concern for that person or look for a way to connect with their feelings, it's okay not to have the conversation in that moment. Or it's okay to say, I'm sorry, ma'am or sir, but I'm really feeling uncomfortable. I'm hoping we can dial things back a little bit. I really want to help you, but right now I'm just feeling really anxious in this conversation. I'm feeling really uncomfortable. That's genuineness too. That helps people too, because it allows them to realize that their behavior may be making you uncomfortable, and that's probably not what they're usually going for. They're usually going for someone who can address their concerns, which is really hard to do when you are uncomfortable or feeling unsafe. One person in the survey even referenced feeling so unsafe as to call for help. And so, again, this is about conveying what it is that we're genuinely feeling, but also coming to it with the approach that I'm looking for a way to connect with this person, to be able to show them that I care about what it is that they care about, and that I hear what they're saying, both the substance of it, but kind of what's behind it, the emotion of it. Again, I want to encourage you to use the chat window to share any questions or thoughts as we're going, because I know I'm talking a little faster than I would otherwise, just to kind of keep us on schedule with our delay. But I also typically teach in a very Socratic, very back and forth way, and so the more I can hear from you all with perspectives or questions, the better, just so I'm sure that I'm covering what I need to cover and explaining things as clearly as I can. So I'm now going to move on to what I think of as reflective listening, and I say this is something that you all may have heard of in a lot of other contexts. It's a very widely respected concept, but it's one that I found to be very, very important when dealing with the public or with public agencies in general. It comes down to a couple of different key concepts, one of which is mirroring, one of which is noticing, and one of which is clarifying. When it comes to mirroring, you all can't see me, but I often try to mirror in my body language some of what I see as what people are feeling. And so if someone seems very upset, I know it's very risky to make physical contact with someone that you don't know. There's some people that would receive that very poorly, so I don't necessarily put my hand on someone's shoulder or something, but I might be come a little closer to them so that what they see from me is I'm here. I'm aware of what it is that you're feeling. I can see you're upset, and I'm paying attention to that, and that's important to me. And kind of in that same vein, I'm saying that. In other words, as obvious as it may seem, and as frustrating as it may be to the other party, people like knowing that they're being heard. Again, both the substance and the emotion behind it. So I hear your frustration. I hear your fear, which, by the way, is often a smokescreen, if you will, fear for a lot of other things. In other words, someone may be actually afraid of losing their home, but they mask it in anger. They mask it in some other emotion that makes it hard to get through to them. But you sometimes get to the bottom of it, and it's actually deep-seated fear that they want you to help them address. What I hear you saying is that you are concerned that this piece of legislation will put you out of business. It sounds like you are concerned about the idea that your community will get destroyed by this piece of policy. It sounds as if you are worried about what we're talking about on HB 10. Is that correct? In other words, there's a part of this that is just about making sure we're getting correct what it is that they're trying to tell us. And even though there are plenty of ways to record what someone is saying, I'm often reminded of that scene in the movie White Men Can't Jump, which was starred Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson. And there's a scene where Wesley Snipes is playing some music for Woody Harrelson, and at one point he says, you're listening to this music, but you're not hearing it. In other words, the person may be taking in the words that I'm saying, but they're not fully getting what it is that I'm trying to say. So, for example, in the context of colleagues or superiors, your superior may be saying to you, something that's really upsetting, and your response to that is, ma'am or sir, it seems like you're angry because I didn't do X, or you're frustrated because we haven't done Y. Just assuring them that you've gotten what it is that they're frustrated about is half the battle, because sometimes I think there is a miscommunication on both sides where one side thinks that they're being clear and the other side isn't, and so you're neglecting to meet the needs of those superiors or those colleagues, not out of malice or spite, but because you truly didn't get what they were saying through no fault of your own or no fault of their own. So part of this is about just really checking to make sure we understand what it is that they're saying. And when it comes to the public, the same thing. I hear you talking about the piece of legislation. Actually, that's not in the legislation. So maybe there's another aspect of this that is disconcerting to you. Can we talk about that? So this gets back to the notion that folks may state opinion as fact, and it's helpful for us to both make sure we heard what they said substantively, and then circle back and say, I heard you say you don't like X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z is not in our bill, or not in the audit, or not in the policy, or whatever it is. I'm looking at it right here. I can send you a copy of it. So maybe there's something else that you've heard, or some other aspect of this that you're concerned about, or did I get that right? This requires a lot of patience, this process, and it may take longer to get through the conversation than otherwise you would like it to, but I think it's hugely important. It's important partly for people to feel respected and to build trust. It's also important because the more you are responding directly to their concern on the basis of clearly articulating it, the better they're going to feel. And when I talk about breathing, sorting, and managing, I think some people talked about kind of keeping their heads in stressful situations. It goes without saying that there are times when we jump into autopilot, that fight or flight kind of reflex, and if the fight reflex is the one that we reach for, that may happen without sort of taking a breath and really thinking for a moment about what it is that we want to say in response. And so there's the physical act of breathing, but it's also, okay, ma'am or sir, let me just make sure I've got everything that we're talking about here. We've got 1, 2, and 3 issues, so let me see if I can kind of tackle each of these issues one at a time. It's a physical breath, to sort of breathe and take a minute, but it's also, just metaphorically speaking, the notion of not just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, but stopping and saying, I just want to kind of recap where we are and where we need to get to by the end of this conversation. Again, I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you very quickly, so please let me know if you have questions or feedback as we're going in the audience chat, but I'm going to move to the next slide. I talked a little bit about the difference between interests and positions, and this feeds into a notion of integrative solutions. So first of all, I want to explain what this slide means and how it relates to what we've been talking about. So the coexist sticker on the left is probably one you've seen many times, and it would be what I would consider an interest, meaning I am interested in living in a place where I coexist with people of a lot of different faith backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds or what have you. It doesn't necessarily mean I'm for or against any particular thing. It just means that, you know, in all things, that's something that I care about. That's a value. That's an interest. On the right, the "Don't Tread on Me" flag from the Revolutionary era was really speaking to a position that folks took, you know, during that period of time, you know, which I think spoke to kind of what they felt about, you know, American patriotism, about, you know, the British and all that sort of thing. So it was very much a position that I think people took during a particular era. And so when it comes to resolving conflict, what we're looking for are integrative solutions that integrate multiple interests. For example, and I'd like to know if anybody on the webinar from the participant side has examples of this, but I'll give you an example from a project that I worked on. So I've done a lot of work in Austin, Texas. And in Austin, there are a tremendous number of events, both for a statewide and local audience, that take place in the area of the state capitol and often involve closing streets near the Capitol, Congress Avenue, the main drag, and so on. Now, also downtown in Austin, not just the state capitol and the office buildings, are lots and lots of restaurants and retail businesses, lots of houses of worship, especially older churches, and now an increasing number of residential buildings as well. So what we had were a group of folks putting on the events and charities benefiting from the events saying, these are huge economic drivers. We want to be able to put on whatever events, you know, we want, you know, as long as we get the permit and all the boxes checked, and close whatever streets we need to close in order for our events to be successful. And then on the other side, the position from a lot of those other stakeholders was, we want you to stop permitting any events in downtown Austin because, frankly, they're doing a lot more harm than good. So one approach to resolving that conflict would have been simply to basically pick a side, to say, you know, we're with the runners doing the marathons and the 10Ks and so on, and we're just going to allow these events to go on regardless of these other concerns. The other option would have been, you know, we're siding with the other stakeholders and we're not going to do any events that close streets downtown anymore. An integrative solution that I worked with a group of stakeholders to come up with basically involved certain limitations on which streets could close when. So certain streets basically were open at almost all times to allow for east-west access to occur, and very, very short duration closures. And then we also made changes to the way people were notified and had the opportunity to slow down a permitting process so that people who had concerns about a particular route weren't just kind of hearing about it at the last second, but actually had a chance before the permit was issued to, you know, speak up and get a resolution to their particular access issue that the event might cause. So the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that it wouldn't have been possible for us to definitively resolve this conflict were it not for our spending the time to figure out what all the interests were and then brainstorming a set of solutions that would encompass all of those interests. So I know that it's very, you know, stereotypical to talk about win-win solutions, but I think that the reason that win-win solutions exist is that what we're talking about when we get win-win solutions are solutions where the different parties feel that their key interests were met. So for a church, for example, it wasn't so much that they cared one way or the other if the event took place. They just cared if people got to church. They could sense that people were stopping their attendance or deciding not to come to church based on how difficult it was time in and time out to get to church. And of course, many churches were relying on passage of the plate. And so as a result, they were facing a hit financially and a threat to their survival as churches as a result. But their interest was really just keeping their church alive. And similarly, the running events, the parades, the street festivals, they wanted to be good neighbors. They wanted to be events and businesses that supported the community and the state of Texas. And they didn't want to be put in a situation where they would, run the risk of, basically getting run out of town because they were, perceived to be a bad apple. So that was really important, I think, for the 15 or 16 folks that I worked with on that process to be able to tease out those underlying interests and to then brainstorm solutions that we then benchmarked against those interests. And so even if it's an internal matter, but especially if you're dealing with a wide array of stakeholders, the challenge is, can you spend the time with that group of stakeholders understanding what their interests are, what those underlying values are? Can you get them to brainstorm in a completely non-judgmental way all kinds of different ideas? And then can you work on evaluating how those ideas line up with the interests? I think that if you are able to do all of those things, at least based on my professional experience across a wide array of issues, you are going to find that you can strike balances that make a lot of folks feel like they got a win. Now, I know someone talked earlier in the chat window about sometimes people don't accept that they don't get their way. And yes, when it comes to public matters, it's very difficult sometimes for one person or one side to win without someone else feeling like they've lost. That's what happens if we sort of make snap judgment, if we try to resolve something by taking a single vote or just picking one person's side. But when we spend extra time to think about what it is that all the different parties to this may care about, and then we look for solutions that speak to those different interests, I think that we are a lot better off. I will try to find a link to that work that I was referencing in Austin, just for anyone who might be interested in it. And if not, I'll try to have it go out later on with Megan and with NCSL. I know it's at the top of the hour. I have been given a little leeway from the NCSL staff. I'll certainly understand if folks need to drop off, but I do have a few other slides here in the presentation, but I'll aim to be done here in about 10 or 15 minutes or so if folks are able to stay. And if not, certainly welcome to catch up on the recording. And again, please chime in with questions or comments even as I'm moving through this so that I can make sure I'm hitting the marks that you all want to hit. I think one of the things for us to bear in mind about the difference between what I'm calling private and public conflict, meaning conflict just among a family or a small organization versus the kind of conflicts we're dealing with, is first of all, everybody's watching, which is to say that a lot of our conversations, even one-on-one conversations, can become public record. Someone can call us on the phone and it turns out they're recording us, and then it's on social media, and then it's out there, and it's out of our hands, not to mention public meetings and so forth. We also have to contend with the fact that everyone feels like they're our bosses, and I know someone made reference to sort of different levels of how people treat us in that way, but I think the reality is that we certainly, many of us, if not all of us, are paid by taxpayer-funded budgets, and so folks have a certain sense of entitlement that they can treat us in a certain way based on that relationship. Or, of course, we have actual bosses, and they feel like they can treat us in a certain way. So I think those are some things we have to be mindful of. And so, to me, that lends itself to a few different specific tactics, one of which is to be as transparent as possible, not just with the public, but also with our team, to show our work. Senator or representative, you had asked for such and such. Here's what I did to try to respond to your request, and here's where I ran into roadblocks, and here's where I need some additional guidance. Or a member of the public that's not satisfied with an outcome, I want to share with you what we did to get public input, to research this issue, to look at best practices, and explain to you how we got where we got. So I think that level of transparency is critical, and I think that there will be people skeptical of the information that you're providing, but that doesn't need to stop us from sharing the information just the same. And what folks choose to do with it is a little less within our control. But I think what people care about is understanding why something is happening, might happen, did happen so that they can, react to it or do something about it on the basis of sort of a level playing field of information. Then there's the notion of listening, which we talked about in depth, but I think, especially in a public context where someone has shown the courage to, call a legislative office or write or stand up at a public meeting or whatever, they want to feel like they're being heard, like most of us do in most of our lives, and so the component of listening is really important. And it's active, reflective listening. It's not just standing there and looking at them blankly. It's the reflective piece of what I'm hearing you say is this, and it sounds like this has been a real long time frustration of yours, reacting to the emotions, reacting to the substance. And when I talk about a return on investment, I actually mean this in a few different ways. So when the public is taking the time to reach out to us, I think we have to realize that most of us, when we think about how we structure the time that we have in our lives, we have a bucket for our work, we have a bucket for our families perhaps, we have a bucket for sleeping if we're lucky, maybe we have a bucket for self-care, doing stuff that's a hobby. Maybe we have a small bucket for some kind of external involvement, like we're part of a, a religious organization or a scout troop or something. Not many of us have buckets carved out for, public meetings and sort of civic engagement. And that's unfortunate, by the way, in terms of the culture of America. It's something I'm working on. But regardless, people are sacrificing time and effort and sometimes wages to reach out to you, to come to your meetings, or to call you, or to email you, or to pursue an issue in great depth. We want to make that worth it. We want to show them that their time was well spent. And so when I talk about giving a return on investment, I'm not meaning that just in the sense that, they're paying our salary so we should do a good job. I mean more, they're taking the time to talk to us. We need to take the time to thoroughly understand their concern, get back to them with some sort of response, even if it's not immediate, do our best to address the concern that they have, and articulate to them that they matter and their concerns matter. So that's really what I mean when I talk about return on investment. It's not just that they're investing in us in terms of paying our wages. It's more that they're investing time and energy and maybe money in pursuing whatever concern they have, and we need to demonstrate that has been time and money well spent, and that's some of the ways to do that. I have a couple of slides here that relate to our roles as facilitator and moderator. This is a lot of the work that I do, and I would encourage you all, as you think about sort of broader public outreach, but even some of the internal team building and strategic planning you may do, to think about involving a third party, because the facilitator is there not to direct any of the content, any of the substance, but to kind of create that safe space where all viewpoints can be heard, to make sure that information is captured, to help others be more effective, to sort of police some bad behavior that the people may engage in, whether it's cutting people off or insults or what have you. So when you're thinking about maybe putting a task force together, a stakeholder group, or just a team meeting to game plan on something, you might want to consider using some outside party, whether it be a local university that has a center for dialogue or dispute resolution, or whether it just be an independent third party that does this kind of work. I think that can be really helpful. And that facilitator, as I indicated, is bringing kind of a toolkit to deal with some difficult situations, a desire to be totally objective and neutral and really focus on healthy dialogue, not on a particular policy outcome. So these are things that you can certainly be trained in to bring to your work, to be sort of facilitative professionals, and it's something that you can draw upon outside resources for. And facilitators, or someone acting in a facilitative capacity, is monitoring the health of the conversation, making sure that people are being heard, making sure everyone around the table is getting a chance to participate, making sure divergent points of view are coming forward. They are maintaining the health of the dialogue by, as I said, protecting people from feeling judged or cut off or insulted and so on. And they're also making sure we stay on track and on topic. Clearly, there will be times when someone in a public meeting or even in a staff meeting kind of takes things in a whole different direction than what we had planned on talking about that day. And so it's important as facilitators or facilitative leaders to kind of understand what they're trying to say as it relates to our topic at hand, or ask that that we hold that for a different time or a different part of the meeting and so on. And this relates to what we were talking about earlier in that conflict triangle when it comes to the situation and how much a situation can impact the resolution of a conflict. So one thing that I really pay a lot of attention to is the setting that we're using for a gathering of stakeholders or staff. Are we looking at each other versus all the folks sitting in pew-like rows looking at the backs of each other's heads? Are we in smaller groups so that we can actually have more of a conversation? Are we at a location like a house of worship or a school or a community center or someplace that feels inviting and welcoming and is accessible to all of the different folks who want to participate? All of that, I think, matters. The timing, both in terms of the duration of the meeting and the time of day and week, matter in terms of making sure folks can attend. How we frame the topic so that it's one that people really understand how it's going to relate to their lives is important. So as opposed to, state budget meeting, it's, how do we ensure the financial well-being of our state's future? Or how do we manage a shortfall that could mean a tax increase or cuts to services? Putting it in real plain terms that people understand, I think is really important. And when it comes to players, I think whether it's an internal meeting or an external meeting, do we have the people around the table who are really going to be impacted by whatever it is that we are dealing with? Who's missing? If we're talking about a business issue, we may need more than just the Chamber of Commerce. We may also need individual business owners. We may need a subset of the overall business community. We may need consumers and consumer advocates. So it's important for us to do that analysis to figure out who might be impacted by what it is that we're trying to work out here, and thereby who should we put at the table to make sure that they have a chance to weigh in and that we have a chance to develop that integrative solution. My last few slides are just a couple of examples that I wanted to highlight. I was able to see a registration list, and so I saw some of the states that you all are from, so I tried to pick some examples from particular states. There's a story that ran on NPR a number of months ago that related to the contentious debate in the Maine legislature over a proposal to ban conversion therapy, which is a treatment that theoretically is designed to make LGBTQ plus people heterosexual. And there was a loud, vociferous debate on the floor of the Maine House, and it eventually led to some training from the National Institute for Civil Discourse, where lawmakers were able to tell their life stories and describe how those experiences shaped their political views. And all of this is in service of keeping those tense moments to a minimum. And so the takeaway there, first of all, is that I would encourage you to look into the National Institute for Civil Discourse out of the University of Arizona. That came together actually in the wake of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords' shooting back in 2011, and a lot of that work has really, been, I think, done in an effort to keep something like that from happening again. But the bigger takeaway is that NICD is doing a lot with legislatures, and I think is well positioned to kind of help lay some groundwork for better communication among elected officials and among staffs that might be worth your looking into. One thing I noticed in Idaho in some research that I was doing is, the notion that if folks don't feel like they are being given a chance to affect a particular decision, they may take it upon themselves to affect that decision anyway. And in this case in Boise, enough people signed petitions to get 2 measures onto the ballot to thwart plans to build some major projects in town. And I'm not going to take a side on the projects. I don't know enough to say one way or the other, but I think what it speaks to is if we don't give the public a version of a bully pulpit, they're going to bully their way onto the pulpit. So we've got to be thinking, how do we proactively and productively involve the key stakeholders, both internal and external, in decisions before we've actually definitively made decisions, because in a lot of cases, if folks don't like the decision, they'll simply step up to the plate and try to change it. In Georgia, I came upon this story where the State Department of Transportation had planned to add some bicycle lanes along Peachtree Road in Atlanta and southern Buckhead to improve traffic flow and so on. the idea was deluged with complaints, and they scrapped it, and the DOT chief engineer said, "This is the public involvement process at work. Throughout the planning and development of this project, we've consistently looked for meaningful ways to engage the public, listen to their concerns, and make sure the input and comments were properly reflected." And so 70% or more of the comments they got opposed adding bike lanes, so they decided on a different configuration. And so what this illustrates, I think, is that we need to be willing as state legislatures to give the public a chance to weigh in on decisions that we haven't yet fully made, and be open to a wide array of different outcomes. Now, there may be some decisions that we just feel like we have to make, and it's okay to say we've made this decision and we aren't taking further public input on it, or our minds are made up. That's okay, but I think there are invariably going to be times when decisions that we make are going to impact large populations that they want to have a say. And I know that at least one or two of you in your survey responses wanted to know about resources for reaching large populations beyond public meetings or beyond sort of face-to-face interactions. I'm happy to discuss that with you offline. It's just a little bit beyond what I can cover. As you can see, I'm already at my 60 minutes or so of this webinar, so please feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about other methods to use to engage large populations. I do want to highlight a couple of other examples. The Utah Citizen Summit is one that I think is very interesting in terms of bringing Utahns of all political, philosophical, and religious backgrounds together to unite in beliefs that we can be more civil, compassionate, inclusive, collaborative, and productive. So I want to encourage not just Utahns, but others to look into that process, the Utah Citizen Summit. I also want to point you to a couple of examples where in Pennsylvania and Colorado, they've taken steps to not just have an engagement strategy for a particular piece of legislation, but they put together engagement strategy frameworks or public participation plans that carry through multiple different projects. So it's almost like a policy for how we're going to engage process after process. So that's the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and the City of Boulder, Colorado, that I think would be worth looking at. And then the last example is the notion of bringing outside third-party conveners into the process. So the Colorado State University Center for Public Deliberation and the David Matthews Center for Civic Life and the Alabama Issues Forums are just two examples of that. And so these may not exist in your state. West Virginia, I know, is well represented on this webinar, and there is an outstanding West Virginia Center for Civic Life that you may be familiar with already, run by some friends of mine. But regardless of whether these kinds of things exist or not, I encourage you to consider the role that a university or other third-party organization that's widely respected and trusted as a convener can play in your efforts to engage a broad population. That is all I've got for today, and I just want to first of all give you all another opportunity to ask any other questions or share any other comments with me now. I'm happy to try to answer them. I also want to thank you all because I know that we've put you through the ringer here to get this webinar done, and I really appreciate those of you who are able to stick around to the end. You were able to deal with difficulty, as the webinar was titled, and come out okay on the other side. So I hope that it was worth the wait. I hope that you got something out of this. My contact information is up on the screen, and I'm happy to visit with you offline. But I think that mostly I want to thank you not just for being here, but for all the information you shared with me ahead of time. I hope that I was able to tailor some of the content to fit some of the direct issues and concerns that you have. If I leave you with nothing else, I think I would leave you with this. Conflict is as normal a part of our lives as any other emotion we may have. It is normal. It is okay. It may make us uncomfortable. It may hinder us from reaching a goal, but it's a normal thing for us to experience. The key, I think, to resolving that conflict is to orient our attitude and our behavior and our situation or in our setting all towards a goal of working with the other side to get a resolution. We may dislike the other side. We may find their behavior to be very uncomfortable. They may treat us in a way we think is unfair. But ultimately, the more that we can connect with them to understand what's really bothering them or really of concern to them, the easier it'll be for us to develop that integrative solution that I think will last. So I will leave that leave it at that for today. Thank you all for your kind words in the chat and for participating so robustly. And thank you very much to my, my teammates, Shannon and Megan, for miraculously making this webinar happen when it was all said and done. I don't know whether I'll be able to hear them at this point, so I think I will probably just sign off here. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks, Veronica, all the folks that are chiming in. I really appreciate it. And I think I will say goodbye for now. And please feel free to be in touch with me offline. I also really appreciate connecting on LinkedIn just so I can learn more about the work that you're doing. So please do that. And you always have a place in the state capital of Texas if you ever find your way down. All right. Thanks, everybody, very much, and I'll be in touch.
Thanks very much, Larry, and thank you all for your patience as we dealt with these technical difficulties. There will be a very brief survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar, and we'd really appreciate your feedback and ideas. And a quick reminder that a recording of this webinar will be available in our archive within a week. And thanks again for your time and participation, and have a great day, everyone.